You remember the sound of the modem connecting before you remember almost anything else about being 7 years old. That screech and stutter that meant the world was about to open up for exactly as long as nobody else in the house needed the phone line. You remember Lisa Frank folders with dolphins leaping through neon rainbows, gel pens that smelled like grape and bled straight through the page, scratch and sniff stickers you saved instead of used. You remember trapper keepers covered in puffy stickers, slap bracelets banned from school because someone got hurt, a single shared family computer in the living room where everyone could see exactly what you were doing online. You remember Blockbuster on a Friday night, the blue and yellow sign, the late fee you tried to talk your way out of at the counter. You remember blowing into a Nintendo cartridge because someone swore that fixed it, and it never did, and you kept doing it anyway. You remember Oregon Trail in the school computer lab, dying of dysentery while a teacher hovered behind your chair, and a Tamagotchi dying in your backpack during third period because nobody had scheduled feeding times around the school day. You remember TRL counting down on a television that took up half the room, a mixtape you burned onto a blank CD for someone specific, an away message with a lyric in it that only one other person was supposed to understand, a MySpace top 8 that mattered more than it had any right to. You remember a world that ran on landlines and library card catalogs and VHS tapes you had to rewind before returning, and you remember it disappearing, piece by piece, while you were still standing in the middle of it. And you remember, less fondly, what came right after. You remember a Tuesday morning in a classroom when the adults in the building stopped pretending things were fine. You remember turning 18 or 20 or 22, walking across a stage in a cap and gown with a degree your parents had told you would open every door that mattered, and finding out within months that the job market on the other side of that door had simply stopped hiring, not slowed, stopped. You remember watching your own parents, the generation that had promised you this was all reliable, watch their retirement accounts and home equity evaporate in the same collapse, which meant the people who were supposed to be your safety net were suddenly busy trying to rebuild their own. You remember the promise breaking in real time. You remember being the one standing there when it happened, diploma in hand, nowhere yet to use it. You are technically a millennial, a term the generational theorists William Strauss and Neil Howe coined in their 1991 book Generations, years before most of you were even teenagers, applied retroactively to a birth window somewhere between 1981 and 1996, depending on which demographer you ask. But that label was built for a chart, not for a person, and it has never fit the way labels are supposed to fit. If you were born early enough to remember a home before the internet arrived in it, you are not the same as someone born late enough that the internet simply already existed there, like electricity already existed, something you were born into rather than something you watched get installed. If you graduated high school before 2008, you are not the same as someone who walked straight into the crash itself before you'd even signed a lease. The label says millennial. The label does not say which side of the rupture you were standing on when it happened. Here is the more accurate description. You exist in the gap. Not a gap in time, a gap in inheritance. Your parents, in most cases, came of age in an economy where a single income could carry a mortgage, where a pension waited quietly at the end of a long career, instead of a patchwork of contracts. Where a 4-year degree cost a fraction of what it costs now and routinely paid for itself within a couple of years of graduating. You were raised inside that story, told explicitly and repeatedly that it was still the operating system of the world you were entering, and then you entered a different system entirely. One with stagnant wages, ballooning tuition, a housing market that had already priced out the entry-level version of adulthood your parents had access to, and a labor market that had quietly replaced permanence with flexibility, a word that sounds generous until you were the one living inside it. You watched the cost of the degree you were told to get rise faster than wages did for the entire time you were earning it, so that by the time you graduated, the loan balance you carried was larger, adjusted for inflation, than any generation of graduates before you had ever carried for the same piece of paper. You did not choose those terms. You were handed them as the price of entry to a system that had already changed its rules of admission without telling you. None of this happened because the work ethic vanished. Economists have tracked a widening gap between productivity and wages going back decades, a gap that means workers, on average, have been producing more value for the same or barely rising pay since well before you entered the labor force. You inherited the tail end of that gap, the part of the curve where the disconnect had compounded for so long that a degree no longer guaranteed the standard of living it had guaranteed your parents for the exact same thing. You were not disciplined. You arrived late to a system that had quietly stopped paying out the way it used to. You also inherited an analog childhood and were handed a digital adulthood with no instruction manual because no generation before you had ever had to build internet etiquette as a fully formed adult instead of absorbing it as a child the way the generation after you did. You were too old to be considered digitally native and too young to remember a working world that actually operated the way you were promised it would. You were taught the rules of one economy and graduated directly into a different one with no transition period, no warning, no chance to recalibrate before the test started. That is not a generational quirk. That is a structural displacement, and it has a shape, and the shape is the gap you have been standing in since you were roughly 22 years old. Here is the thing that needs to be said about why this has always felt heavier than ordinary disappointment, even though nothing about it looks like anything worth grieving. In 1999, the family therapist and researcher Pauline published a book called Ambiguous Loss: Learning to Live with Unresolved Grief, describing a specific kind of mourning that happens when something is lost without a clear ending, no funeral, no death certificate, nothing society recognizes as worth marking. Her original research focused on families dealing with a missing person, someone gone without confirmation of what happened to them, leaving the people left behind unable to grieve cleanly because there was nothing definite to grieve. You were never handed a funeral for the version of adulthood you were promised. Nobody announced its death. There was no single event where the secure job, the affordable house, the one-income household, the retirement that waited reliably at the end of 30 years, all quietly stopped being available to you on the same terms they had been available to the generation before yours. It simply dissolved, slowly enough that you spent years unsure whether you were failing to reach it or whether it had stopped existing entirely. Why does that feel so personal if it happened to millions of people at once? Because grief is always personal, even when the cause is structural. Boss's own research makes that explicit. Ambiguous loss is felt individually, in a body, in one specific life, even when its cause is shared by an entire generation. That uncertainty is the exact mechanism she describes, and it explains why so many people your age have struggled to name what they are actually upset about. You are not grieving a single loss. You are grieving something that never had a death certificate, which makes it almost impossible to grieve cleanly. You are not the only person who has lived this. That matters not as comfort, but as a research fact. An entire cohort, identifiable by birth year alone, shows the same shift on the same psychological measures across studies run by different researchers in different years using different methods, arriving at the same conclusion independently. This was never an individual failure to adapt. It was a population-level response to a population-level event. And population-level responses are not character flaws. They are data points. Here is what that actually built, and here is where the research stops being abstract and starts being useful. In 2004, the psychologist Jean Twenge, along with her colleagues Li King Zhang and Charles Im, published a cross-temporal meta-analysis in the journal Personality and Social Psychology Review, tracking how young Americans' sense of control over their own lives had shifted between 1960 and 2002. What they found was a steady, measurable rise in what psychologists call external locus of control, the belief that outcomes are shaped less by your own effort and more by forces outside your influence, luck, circumstance, systems larger than any one person. That shift tracked almost exactly with the years you were coming of age inside it.
You were told explicitly by parents and teachers and guidance counselors who believed it themselves that the relationship between effort and outcome was dependable. Work hard, get the grades, get the degree, and the rest follows, in roughly that order. That was the entire architecture of how you were raised to think about your own future. You did the unpaid internship because you were told it would lead somewhere. You sent out the resumes, dozens of them, sometimes hundreds, into a market that had simply contracted past the point of absorbing you. This is why so many people in your cohort describe their 20s not as a failure, but as a fog, a sense of trying everything and watching nothing land the way it was supposed to. That fog has a name now. It is what externality of control feels like from the inside, before anyone tells you what to call it. An external locus of control is not a personality flaw, and it is not a symptom of entitlement, whatever you were told. It is what a rational mind does when it has been shown over and over that effort and outcome have come uncoupled. You did not lose faith in yourself. You lost faith in a contract, and the contract had already stopped honoring its end before you ever signed it. But the more consequential piece of this is not only what you came to believe, it is what actually happened to you economically in terms specific enough to leave no room for doubt. The economist Lisa Kahn, in a 2010 paper published in the journal Labor Economics, studied what happens over time to people who graduate college during a recession compared to people who graduate during a stable economy. What she found was not a temporary setback that resolved itself once the market recovered. Graduates who entered the workforce during a downturn ended up on average in lower-wage jobs and roles below their qualifications for years afterward, sometimes for the better part of a decade, well past the point the broader economy had technically rebounded. This is sometimes called the scarring effect of recession-era graduation, and it does not care how hard you worked once you finally found a job. It only cares about the year printed on your diploma. And here is the number that makes all of this concrete instead of anecdotal, the number that turns a feeling into a fact. In 2017, the economist Raj Chetty and a team of researchers published a paper in the journal Science titled The Fading American Dream, measuring something very specific: the percentage of children in each birth cohort who go on to earn more than their own parents did, adjusted for inflation, at the same age. For children born in 1940, that number sat around 90%. For children born in the 1980s, your cohort, precisely your cohort, that number had fallen to roughly 50%, a coin flip. The American dream, defined in the most literal economic terms anyone has bothered to measure it, went from a near guarantee to a coin flip across 2 generations, and you are the generation the coin landed on. That single statistic shows up everywhere once you know to look for it. It shows up in home ownership, where your cohort reached that milestone later and at a lower rate at the same age than every generation measured before you. The Pew Research Center reported in 2016 that for the first time since 1880, living with a parent had become the single most common living arrangement for adults in their 20s and early 30s, more common than living with a spouse or a partner. None of that is a personal failing happening in isolation. It is the same coin landing the same way over and over across an entire generation at once.
So what do you do with a childhood built on a promise and an adulthood built on its absence? Psychology has something specific to say about that, more specific than people usually give it credit for. In 2000, the developmental psychologist Jeffrey Jensen Arnett published a paper in American Psychologist introducing the concept of emerging adulthood, a distinct developmental period roughly between the ages of 18 and 29, marked by active identity exploration, instability, a persistent sense of being in between, and a deferral of the markers that used to define adult life on schedule: a stable career, a mortgage, a wedding paid for without going into debt for it. Arnett was not describing immaturity. He was describing a structural response to a world that no longer handed those markers out on the old timeline, to anyone, regardless of effort.
The median age of first marriage and the median age of first home purchase both moved later for your generation than for any generation on record before you, not because you valued those milestones any less, but because the economic floor required to reach them had moved further away. You did not choose to delay those milestones out of indecision. You delayed them because the economy delayed them for you, and psychology built an entire developmental category to describe what an extended delay like that does to a person's sense of identity over years instead of months. Emerging adulthood became the normal experience for your cohort specifically because the milestones that used to arrive reliably in someone's early 20s moved further down the timeline, sometimes by the better part of a decade, and you lived every uncertain year of that gap in real time without a name for what was happening to you until the research finally caught up to what you were already living through. Here's the thing that needs to be said plainly because it does not get said often enough. None of this means something was lost in you. It means something specific was built in its place, and it is worth naming exactly what that something is. Consider what an extended period of instability actually trains in a person who survives it instead of being flattened by it. Arnett's later work on emerging adulthood notes that the same instability that defers traditional milestones also forces a longer period of active identity exploration, a longer runway to figure out who you actually are instead of inheriting an identity wholesale from your parents' generation, the way earlier cohorts often did. You did not get to coast into adulthood on inherited certainty. You had to build your own sense of self piece by piece, recalibrating more than once because the ground kept shifting underneath whatever plan you'd made. That is not damage, that is repetition. And repetition in any psychological system is how adaptability gets built. Consider too what the instability did to your relationship with work itself. You came of age just as the traditional single-employer career path was quietly disappearing, replaced by contract work, freelance income, side projects stitched together into something resembling stability. Nobody planned that for you. You built it out of necessity, often while still believing it was a personal failure to not have the one stable job your parents had. It took years for business schools and career consultants to give that pattern a respectable name, the portfolio career, the multi-hyphenate professional identity. You were living it before it had language, the same way you were living emerging adulthood before Arnett gave it a name, the same way you were living ambiguous loss before Boss gave it a name. You have spent your entire adult life ahead of the vocabulary required to describe your own experience. You are also, and this part rarely gets named out loud, bilingual in a way no generation before or after you has had to be. You remember a world before the internet, which means you are not naive about what gets lost when a society moves almost entirely online. The unsupervised time, the boredom that used to be a normal part of a day, the slowness that used to be allowed. But you also came of age inside the internet's actual construction, which means you were not intimidated by it the way some of the generation before you still are. You can translate between your parents, who often experience technology as something imposed on them from outside, and the generation after you, who experience it as something they were simply born inside of and never had to consciously learn. You are the translation layer between two worldviews that do not naturally understand each other without help, and that is a skill, not a coincidence of birth year. The locus of control finding, the one that sounds discouraging on its surface, has a second half that tends to get left out of the conversation. Twenge's broader body of research on generational shifts in psychological traits consistently finds that cohorts who score higher on external locus of control also tend to score higher on tolerance for ambiguity and lower on rigid single-track thinking about how a life is supposed to unfold in order. A belief that outcomes are not entirely within your control, earned the hard way instead of taught in theory, tends to produce a person who can hold more than one possible future in mind at once without panicking when the first one falls through. You learned to do that before you turned 30. Most people never learn it at all, because most people are never forced to. Boss's own research on ambiguous loss does not end at naming the grief. It identifies the specific skill that allows people to live well inside a loss that never resolved cleanly.
And that skill is tolerance for ambiguity, the capacity to hold uncertainty without demanding it collapse into a clear answer before you can move forward. That is not a coincidence relative to your own life. You built that exact tolerance the hard way over 2 decades of plans that had to be redrawn mid-execution. You were not bad at certainty. You were simply trained, earlier and more thoroughly than most people ever are, in functioning without it. You have now lived through, at minimum, 3 distinct economic ruptures inside a single working lifetime. The 2008 crash hit just as you were trying to start a career, eliminating the entry-level positions you needed and normalizing the unpaid internship as a substitute for them. The decade after that normalized gig work and contract instability as a permanent feature of adult employment for your cohort specifically, rather than the exception it had been for the generation before you. And in 2020, a global disruption displaced nearly everyone's plans at once, yours included, again, often right as you were finally rebuilding the stability the first 2 ruptures had cost you. Each time, you recalibrated. Each time, you adjusted the plan without losing the thread of who you actually were underneath the plan. That is not a coping mechanism you should feel embarrassed about. That is a form of psychological training most generations never had to undergo, delivered to you on a timeline you did not choose and would not have chosen, and you came out the other side of it still intact, still building, still capable of imagining a future even after watching the first one dissolve in front of you while you were still young enough that it should have broken something permanently. It didn't. You exist in the gap, still, and you will likely exist there for the rest of your working life, because the gap is not a phase you age out of, it is the specific historical position your birth year assigned you. But existing in a gap is not the same as falling through one. You did not fall. You built a floor where there wasn't supposed to be one, out of recalibration, out of tolerance for ambiguity you were never supposed to need this early, out of a fluency between 2 worlds that nobody asked you to develop and that you developed anyway. You were not the generation that lost the American dream. You were promised a version of it that had already stopped being statistically true before you were old enough to test it for yourself, and the data says so plainly in a peer-reviewed journal, in a number you can point to in hand to anyone who doubts you. But you were also the generation that kept building anyway, without the blueprint you were promised, without the guarantee your parents had, without the stability that was supposed to come standard with a degree and a decent work ethic. You built an identity out of repeated recalibration instead of inherited certainty. You learned to hold more than one possible future without breaking under the weight of either one. You became fluent in 2 worlds at once, the one you were born into and the one you helped construct from scratch with no instructions because nobody else had built it yet. That is not what you lost. That is what you became. If this finally named something you have been carrying for a long time without the language for it, the next video goes into a part of this generation's psychology that almost nobody has addressed directly. If you want more videos like this, subscribe.